David Brown. On the night of December 28, 1999, a corrections captain named David Knaps was handed a slip of paper and asked to read it. The words on it had been written by the warden of the prison himself, and they made a strange promise. No one would be harmed. No charges would be filed. No report, no official document. No record of any kind would ever describe what was happening inside that building. Two of the inmates in the room put their signatures beside the warden's. One of them was David Brown, and by the time the warden's tactical team threw a percussion grenade and stormed the place, Captain Knaps was already lying dead in an employee restroom, and his blood had soaked through every layer of the clothing David Brown was wearing. It was still early that evening, around 8:30, when 6 men serving life at the Louisiana State Penitentiary made their move inside the Camp D Education building. They were armed with a homemade knife, a small hammer, and a handful of improvised weapons, and they took 3 officers hostage. The plan, borrowed from a hostage standoff that Cuban detainees had pulled off elsewhere in Louisiana just weeks earlier, was to take the guards' uniforms, walk out through the secure sally port, and run for Canada. It fell apart almost immediately. Captain Knaps, 49 years old, refused to hand over his keys, and he paid for that refusal with his life. Knaps was not a stranger to the place. His father had worked there, 5 of his siblings had worked there, and so had 2 of his own children. For the Knaps family, the prison everyone simply called Angola was the family business. He was the first guard killed inside its walls since 1972. The standoff itself dragged on for roughly 2 hours. There were demands, there was negotiation, and there was the warden's handwritten note, which in the end changed nothing about how the night closed out. When the tactical team finally went in, they used a percussion grenade and moved through the building room by room. One of the escapees, Joel Durham, was shot and killed. Another, David Mathis, was shot in the face but somehow lived. The 5 men who came out of that building alive would soon be known in the newspapers and in the courtrooms as the Angola 5. In March of 2004, a grand jury indicted all 5 of them for first-degree murder, and the state announced it would seek the death penalty for everyone. David Brown's road to that restroom had started years earlier. He had been paroled on a theft conviction in May of 1992, and 2 days later, he shot and killed a man named Harvey Reese in Marrero. Convicted of second-degree murder, he was sent to Angola for life, and by the night of the escape, he was 7 years into that sentence. Brown never denied what he did during the standoff. He admitted that he had dragged the bleeding captain into the employee restroom and held him down while another inmate swung the mallet. The state never argued that Brown delivered the killing blows. What it argued was that he had joined the plot intending for Knaps to die, and the physical evidence was hard to wave away. DNA testing found the captain's blood soaked through every layer of Brown's clothes, on his hands, and even on his shoelace. Put plainly, almost everything Brown had been wearing that night had Knaps's blood on it. Then there was the note. During the standoff, Warden Burl Kane had signed that handwritten promise that nothing would be recorded and no one would be charged, and Brown and another inmate signed it too. Years later, justices would look at that improvised deal with open skepticism. Brown's own attorney put it bluntly in court, arguing that his client knew Knaps was already dead and knew that everyone was about to find out. Under Louisiana's law of principles, a man does not have to deliver the fatal blow to be guilty of first-degree murder. If the state could show that Brown acted with the specific intent to kill, or that he was a willing part of a plan he knew would leave someone dead, then in the eyes of the law he was as responsible as the man swinging the mallet. That was the case the prosecution built, and the physical evidence made it close to airtight. Holding a wounded man down while he is beaten to death, is not the conduct of a bystander. It would be more than a decade before Brown stood trial. A West Feliciana Parish jury convicted him, and on October 30th, 2011, after deliberating for only about 50 minutes, they sentenced him to death. According to coverage in The Advocate, the jurors reached that decision after hearing tearful testimony from relatives on both sides. The prosecutor, Hugo Holland, described Brown to the jury as a fourth-offense felon, a murderer, and a thief. The captain's sister, Carolyn Whitstein, testified through tears that Knaps had been like a father to her, and that he had not deserved the beating he got or the way he was murdered. Brown's defense attorney, Clay Calhoun, asked the jury to consider the childhood his client had survived. Brown's mother, who was mentally ill, had given birth to him when she was barely 13 or 14 years old, and Calhoun told the jurors they could not imagine walking in Brown's shoes and still becoming the people they were today. The appeals stretched on for years, and they turned on a single withheld statement. But here is the detail that nearly everyone missed at the time. An inmate named Richard Domingue had said that Barry Edge confessed it was he and Jeffrey Clark, and no one else, who decided to kill Knaps. In 2014, a retired judge named Jerome Winsberg overturned Brown's death sentence, though not his conviction, finding a reasonable probability that the jury would have reached a different verdict if that statement had not been suppressed. An appeals court reversed him. Then, on February 22, 2016, the Louisiana Supreme Court reinstated the death sentence, ruling that the Domingue statement said nothing about who had actually killed the captain. The United States Supreme Court declined to take the case that June. There was one more strange turn. In 2017, a state Supreme Court justice named Scott Crichton had to recuse himself after making remarks on the radio about the men involved and about the death penalty, including a comment that if the state was going to have capital punishment, it ought to use it. A second appeal was rejected in January of 2022, and the United States Supreme Court turned the case away again in April of 2023. The prosecutor, Juliette Clark, summed up the state's position in a single line. Nothing Barry Edge said, she argued, could erase the evidence that was literally on David Brown's body because he had been caught red-handed with the captain's blood. David Brown remains alive, on death row at Angola as of 2025. Brown's case is decades old now, the kind of slow grind through courtrooms and appeals that can take 20 years to settle. But Angola is still producing killers, and the next man on this list did not arrive with any long history at all. His violence was sudden, and the explanation he gave for it was something no jury in that courtroom had ever heard quite like before. Melvin Lopez. On the afternoon of April 8, 2015, a New Orleans police officer named Jeff Wellborn answered a 911 call and walked up to a house on West Park Court. He never had to ask what had happened. The man who met him at the door, Melvin Lopez, said it himself, twice, in Spanish. He had killed her. Inside on the floor, the officer found Lopez's own cousin, a woman named Esperanza Jimenez Rojas, and the scene left very little to investigate. Esperanza Jimenez Rojas was family. She and Lopez shared the home where she died, which means the last face she saw belonged to a relative she had every reason to trust. Beyond that connection, she has remained largely a name in court filings, one more person whose life ended at the hands of someone who was supposed to be on her side. The forensic case against Lopez was, in the words of the courts that later reviewed it, overwhelming. She had been stabbed 10 times, and one of those wounds, to her left lung, was the one that killed her. Lopez's bloody footprints across the scene matched the Jordan shoes he was wearing. Her DNA was found on his clothing, and his own DNA was recovered from under her fingernails. The kind of evidence that quietly tells investigators a victim fought back hard before she died. The address on West Park Court became a fixed point in every court filing that followed. The house where a woman was found dead on her own floor, while her cousin stood at the door waiting for police to arrive. There was no mystery to solve and no suspect to hunt. What no one could explain was the why of it, and the answer Lopez would eventually give from the witness stand only made it stranger. This is where the case takes a turn no one expected. What made the trial unusual was not the evidence at all. It was the defense. By the time Lopez went before a jury, he had changed his plea to not guilty by reason of insanity, and he took the stand to explain what he believed had really happened in that house. It was not him, he testified. It was the devil. He told the court that it had not been his soul, his heart, or his personality that killed his cousin, and that he had never intended to kill her at all. The jury did not accept it. They convicted Lopez of second-degree murder, although it is worth pausing on how they did it. Under Louisiana law at the time, a jury did not have to be unanimous to convict, and the panel that found Lopez guilty was a split one. It was a feature of the state's justice system that the United States Supreme Court would later strike down as unconstitutional, but it was still in force the day Lopez was found guilty. On November 18, 2016, he was sentenced to life in prison without the benefit of probation, parole, or suspension of sentence. The Louisiana Fourth Circuit Court of Appeal affirmed both the conviction and the sentence in March of 2018. To win a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity, the law generally asks whether a person could tell right from wrong at the moment of the act. Lopez's claim that a literal devil had taken control of his body did not clear that bar, especially when it was set beside a crime scene that pointed so directly and so completely back to him. The footprints, the DNA, the confession at the door. None of it left room for the version of events he offered from the witness stand. Lopez arrived at Angola in late February of 2017, a foreign national living in the country illegally, now serving life on the same prison farm as the men of the 1999 escape. For most people, a life sentence without parole is where the story ends. For Lopez, according to authorities, it was not. And somehow, it got worse. On the night of February 3, 2026, Lopez allegedly stabbed another inmate to death. The victim was a 35-year-old man named Jonathan Robertson, who was himself serving 75 years for armed robbery and attempted armed robbery. The two men had gotten into a fight, and by the end of it, Robertson was dead. The Louisiana Department of Public Safety and Corrections, along with the West Feliciana Parish Sheriff's Office, booked Lopez on account of murder. Violence has a long history at Angola, between inmates and the people paid to guard them. But a man already buried under a sentence of life without parole, with nothing left for the state to take away, allegedly killing again on the inside, is the kind of case that raises an uncomfortable question about what a prison can really hold. There is no longer tail deterrent for a man in Lopez's position. A second life sentence means little to someone already serving the first. It matters to be careful here, because that second case has not yet been tested in front of a jury. The killing of Jonathan Robertson is, at this point, an allegation and a charge, not a conviction, and Lopez is presumed innocent of it until a court rules otherwise. What is not in dispute is where he is. As of February of 2026, Melvin Lopez is incarcerated at Angola, already serving a life sentence for one killing, and now facing a new murder charge for another. Lopez acted alone, in a single violent afternoon. The men involved in the 1999 escape had spent weeks planning theirs, and the inmate the state considered one of the chief architects of that plan was about to become the first of them to face a jury. He had already heard a death sentence read out against him once before. Jeffrey Cameron Clark. It took a jury less than 2 hours to decide that Jeffrey Cameron Clark had helped beat a corrections captain to death. It took them about 33 more minutes to decide that he should be executed for it. That is not a typo, by the way. And for Clark, none of this was unfamiliar ground, because this was the second time in his life that a Louisiana jury had sentenced him to die. His first trip to death row had come back in the 1980s. On October 18, 1984, he murdered a man named Andrew Cheswick, the assistant manager of a Baton Rouge nightclub called Studebaker's, during an armed robbery. He was convicted and originally sentenced to death, but the Louisiana Supreme Court vacated that death sentence in 1986 while upholding the conviction, and he was resentenced to life. By the night of the Angola escape, he had been behind bars for roughly 15 years. When investigators reconstructed the events of December 28, 1999, Clark's name sat near the center of the plot. He was identified as one of the primary planners of the escape and as one of the men who physically attacked Captain Knaps. Within the group, Clark was no follower. The state portrayed him as one of the inmates who shaped the breakout from the beginning, and who was in the room when the captain was beaten, and the blood that saturated his clothing told the same story his own words later would. On May 24, 2011, he became the first of the 5 surviving inmates to stand trial. The jury had been selected from St. Tammany Parish and brought in to hear the case in West Feliciana, and they did not take long. In under 2 hours, they convicted him of first-degree murder. About half an hour after that, they recommended death. The contrast between Clark's 2 death sentences says something about how these cases were fought across the decades. The first, in the 1980s, was thrown out by the state's own high court on the way to a life term. The second, almost 30 years later, rested on physical evidence and a confession that gave the jury very little room to doubt, which may go a long way toward explaining why they needed only minutes to send him back to death row. These trials had, by then, become some of the most expensive prosecutions in Louisiana history. By one estimate drawn from state corrections figures and reported by the Marshall Project, the state had spent more than $14 million prosecuting and defending the 5 men through their trials and appeals. The money went to expert witnesses, to years of defense work, to appeals that climbed all the way to the nation's highest court and back. One defense attorney involved in the cases, Nick Trentacosta, observed that after 15 years and $14 million and counting, only a single death sentence had actually resulted from all of it. The figure became a recurring point in Louisiana's own legislative arguments over what capital punishment truly costs the state. The Louisiana Supreme Court affirmed Clark's conviction and sentence on December 19, 2016. Writing for a unanimous court, Justice Jeff Hughes laid out the evidence in a decision that ran more than 150 pages. Knaps's blood, he noted, had been found on every outer layer of Clark's clothing and had saturated the layers underneath. And there was Clark's own jailhouse confession, in which he admitted taking part in the attack and striking the captain in the head with one of the mallets. Clark had raised 37 separate claims of error on appeal. What comes next is the part that still does not quite make sense. 2 former St. Tammany Parish sheriff's deputies had acknowledged having sexual relationships with 2 of the alternate jurors after the trial ended. And no, that is not made up. It was the sort of revelation that can occasionally unravel a verdict. But Justice Hughes, after what he described as a thorough review of the law and the evidence, found no merit in any of Clark's 37 arguments, including that one. A second appeal was rejected in June of 2019. Today, Jeffrey Cameron Clark remains alive on death row at Angola, one of two men still condemned to die for the killing of Captain David Knaps. The other is David Brown. Two of the five were now headed for the execution chamber. But the third man on this list took the one path none of the others did. He never gave a jury the chance to weigh his fate at all, and he is the only one of the group who can say he survived the night the raid came through the door. David Axel Mathis. When the warden's tactical team finally breached the education building that night, two of the escapees were still holding a hostage in a storage room. One of them, a 26-year-old inmate named Joel Durham, was shot and killed where he stood. The other man took a round to the face and lived. His name was David Mathis, and of the five men who would eventually answer for the death of Captain David Knaps, he is the only one who never let a jury decide what should happen to him. Mathis had come to Angola as a teenager. According to contemporaneous coverage of his trial, he was 16 years old in 1992 when he killed his 62-year-old adoptive grandmother, a woman named Gloria Ryder, at their home in Baker, Louisiana, on Valentine's Day. He was convicted of second-degree murder that August and sentenced to life. It is a detail worth treating with some caution, because it traces back to a single old trial article, rather than a court record that has been independently confirmed. But it is the account that has followed Mathis ever since. By 1999, he was one of the 6 men who tried to break out. When the standoff collapsed, officers storming the building found him and Durham holding one of the hostages in an inmate property storage room. The entry team killed Durham and shot Mathis in the face. By most accounts, a wound like that should have ended him. It did not. He recovered, was returned to custody, and surviving meant that, unlike the man cut down beside him, Mathis would still have to answer for what the group had done. He turned out to be the only one of the 5 to resolve his case without a trial. On Friday, August 17, 2012, he stood before Judge Jerome Winsberg and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, in a deal that took the death penalty off the table. Winsberg sentenced him on the spot to life in prison without the benefit of probation, parole, or suspension of sentence, and ordered that it be served consecutively to the life term he was already serving for the killing of his grandmother. The plea raised a hard question, and the captain's family clearly felt it. Mathis had been there, in the room, holding a hostage when the raid came through the door. 2 of the men he escaped with were sentenced to die for that same night. Mathis, by pleading guilty and accepting a second life sentence, avoided the execution chamber entirely. The lead prosecutor from Jefferson Parish, Tommy Block, said afterward that the state believed it could have proven the case against Mathis even at trial, and prosecutors framed the deal as a certain outcome that spared everyone years of appeals. But for a family that had already sat through one capital trial, a negotiated life term landed as something short of full justice. Knaps's sister, Christine Goff, said the prosecutors had not been sure they could push Mathis all the way to a death sentence. She did not think he should have gotten off the way he did, but as she put it, there was nothing the family could do about it. So David Mathis sits at Angola today, serving 2 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole for 2 separate killings nearly a decade apart. He survived a bullet to the face, outlived the man shot dead beside him, and avoided the death sentence that 2 of his fellow escapees received. But Mathis only struck because others struck first. The men who swung the hammers, the inmate the state called the mastermind, whose own jury could never agree on whether he should die, and an entirely separate group of prisoners whose case reaches back nearly 30 years before any of this, to another guard killed inside the very same walls, are all still ahead. If you're getting something out of this video and you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time to do it. It genuinely helps the channel keep these cases coming. Albert Woodfox. Albert Woodfox spent more time in solitary confinement than any prisoner in American history. The number is hard to even hold in your head. 43 years and 10 months, almost all of it inside a concrete cell that measured 6 feet by 9, for 23 hours out of every 24. He walked in as a young man in his 20s and came out a man approaching 70. And across all of those decades, the state of Louisiana never once produced a piece of physical evidence tying him to the crime that kept him there. So how does a person lose nearly 44 years of his life over a murder case that fell apart every time a court looked at it closely? Decades before one Louisiana attorney general would call him the most dangerous man on the planet, Woodfox was just another young inmate at Angola, serving time for armed robbery. The turn in his life came almost by accident. While he was being sentenced on a robbery charge, he escaped custody and fled to Harlem, and it was there that he first met members of the Black Panther Party. He later described that moment as a light switching on in a room inside himself that he had not known existed. When he was eventually returned to Angola, he carried those politics back through the gate with him. In 1971, Woodfox, along with Herman Wallace and a handful of others, helped organize what is described as the only official prison chapter of the Black Panther Party anywhere in the country. Right there inside Angola. They pushed back against the prison's racial segregation, against the brutality of the guards, against the exploitative labor, and against the endemic culture of inmate rape that the administration had tolerated for years. To the men running Angola, that kind of organizing did not look like reform. It looked like a threat. On April 17, 1972, a 23-year-old white guard named Brent Miller was found stabbed to death inside a prison dormitory. Woodfox and Wallace, both already serving robbery sentences, were indicted within weeks, and in January of 1974, they were convicted of his murder. Here is the part that would shadow the case for the next 4 decades. There was no physical evidence connecting either man to the killing. A bloody fingerprint left at the scene matched neither of them, nor anyone else investigators ever identified. The state's central witness was an inmate informant, described by the men's supporters as legally blind and repeatedly rewarded for his cooperation, whose account would eventually come apart at the seams. Woodfox said the same thing his entire life. He had been framed for his politics. Their case did not stay inside Louisiana. Amnesty International took it up, naming the men prisoners of conscience and organizing letter-writing campaigns on their behalf, and the case drew in members of Congress, the United Nations, documentary filmmakers, and a Peabody-winning radio series. At one point, the warden of Angola, Burl Kane, testified that the men were kept in their isolation cells because of what he called their black pantheism. For their supporters, that single phrase said everything about why 3 men had been buried alive in concrete. The day-to-day reality of that confinement was its own kind of sentence. Woodfox later wrote about the routine of it, the gassings and the beatings, the strip searches, the years measured out in a space barely longer than a man is tall. He described teaching himself to manage the panic of the walls pressing in, hour after hour, with nothing to do and nowhere to go, and he was honest about the toll it took on him. That he came out of all those years able to speak in full sentences, let alone write a book about them, struck many of the people who met him as a small miracle in itself. The courts, over time, came to agree that something had gone badly wrong. His first conviction was overturned in 1992 over inadequate legal counsel. He was retried and convicted again in 1998, and that conviction was thrown out as well. In June of 2015, a federal judge named James Brady ordered Woodfox released without conditions and barred the state from trying him a fourth time. Pointing to his age and failing health, the disappearance of witnesses after so many years, the court's own lack of confidence that Louisiana could give him a fair trial, and the sheer prejudice of a man having spent more than 40 years in solitary. The state's attorney general blocked the release on appeal, insisting that the evidence against Woodfox was overpowering. The end, when it finally came, was quieter than the fight that preceded it. On February 19, 2016, his 69th birthday, Woodfox entered a plea of no contest to the lesser charges of manslaughter and aggravated burglary, and he was released for time already served. His attorney was careful to stress that a no-contest plea was not an admission of guilt. The Attorney General at the time framed the deal as serving the best interest of justice and bringing a measure of closure to Brent Miller's family after a prosecution that had stretched across the better part of half a century. 3 years later, Woodfox published a memoir about those decades in isolation. It won an American Book Award and was named a finalist for both the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. In it, he wrote that he had witnessed the worst of what one human being can do to another, that he carried the scars of beatings and loneliness and persecution, and that he had still refused to let any of it take his humanity from him. He spent his final years traveling the world to speak against the use of solitary confinement. He died on August 4, 2022, at the age of 75, of complications from COVID-19. Woodfox did not stand trial alone back in 1974. The man indicted and convicted right alongside him would spend nearly as long inside those same isolation cells. And when his freedom finally arrived, it would come wrapped in a cruelty that is genuinely hard to forget. Herman Wallace. Herman Wallace walked out of a Louisiana prison a free man on the evening of October 1, 2013, after more than 4 decades behind bars, most of those years spent in solitary confinement. 3 days later, he was dead. And in the 72 hours between his release and his last breath, the state of Louisiana moved to charge him with the very same murder all over again. Wallace was a New Orleans native who had come to Angola serving 25 to 50 years for armed and bank robbery. Then, in 1974, he and Albert Woodfox were convicted of killing the guard Brent Miller, and Wallace vanished into the same system of closed cell restriction that swallowed his co-defendant. He would spend roughly 41 years in isolation, in a cell no larger than a parking space, for 23 hours of every day. Closed cell restriction, the official name for it, allowed a single hour out for a shower or a small caged yard, and then it was back behind the steel. For most people, 4 years of that would count as extraordinary punishment. Wallace lived it for more than 4 decades. What is remarkable about Wallace is what he managed to build inside his own head, while the world around him shrank to nothing. A New York artist named Jackie Sumel began writing to him and posed a simple, almost unbearable question. What kind of house does a man who has lived in a 6 by 9 foot cell for more than 30 years dream of? Their collaboration grew around that question into an art project, and then into an Emmy-winning documentary. A man with nothing but a concrete box and his own imagination had spent years designing gardens, wide rooms, and open space he would likely never see. There was one voice that troubled the state's certainty more than any defense attorney ever could. Leontine Rogers had been Brent Miller's wife, a young widow on the day her husband was killed in that dormitory. Over the years, as she learned more about the case, she came to believe that the men convicted of his murder were innocent. She said it was time for the state to stop pretending there was any real evidence that Woodfox had killed Brent, and she pointed to the plain fact that the centerpiece of the whole prosecution had been the word of a legally blind man offered up as an eyewitness. When the widow of the murdered guard no longer believes the men in prison did it, the foundation under a case starts to look very thin. From inside those cells, the three men did not simply wait out their sentences. They organized. Through lawsuits and a hunger strike that ran for 45 days, they forced the prison to change how it treated them, winning contact visits, time outdoors, more frequent reviews of their status, and an end to the practice of sliding their meals through a slot at the bottom of the cell door. It was a strange kind of victory, fought entirely from inside a 6-by-9-foot room, but it was a real one. By 2013, Wallace was dying of liver cancer. On October 1st, a federal chief judge named Brian Jackson overturned his conviction, ruling that women had been unconstitutionally excluded from the grand jury that indicted him back in the 1970s, a violation of the 14th Amendment, and ordered his immediate release. That same evening, after more than 40 years inside, Herman Wallace left the prison. He had 3 days left. On October 3rd, a grand jury in West Feliciana Parish re-indicted him for Miller's murder. The district attorney did not soften it at all, stating flatly that as far as he was concerned, Wallace was a murderer. Wallace's legal team was stunned, pointing out that the state had just asked a grand jury to indict a man who everyone knew had only days left to live. And somehow, a story about 4 decades in a box found a way to get worse. The new indictment would never reach a courtroom. Herman Wallace died on October 4th, 2013, at the home of a friend in New Orleans, 3 days after he walked free, at the age of 71. His attorneys said afterward that he had endured what almost none of us could ever imagine, and that he had carried himself through it with a grace and dignity that held all the way to the end. Among the last things he told them was that he was free. He said it twice. 2 of the Angola 3 were now accounted for, one of them dead in freedom, and the other gone before him. The third man's story is stranger than either, because he was not even at Angola on the day Brent Miller was killed. Robert Hillary King. Robert King was not even at Angola on the day Brent Miller died. He was transferred into the prison weeks afterward, and within days of arriving, he was locked away in solitary confinement over an investigation that no one ever fully explained to him. He would remain in that isolation for 29 years. The official reason he was given, at least in the beginning, was that he had wanted to act as a kind of jailhouse lawyer for another inmate. King was born in Gonzales, Louisiana, in 1942, and raised in New Orleans. He first walked into Angola at 18 years old, on an armed robbery conviction he always disputed, after a young life of petty crime and a brief run as a semi-professional boxer who fought under the name Speedy King. He cycled in and out of custody more than once, and it was on one of those returns, in 1972, just after Miller's death, that he was pulled into the orbit of the men who would become known as the Angola 3. In 1973, while he was already sitting in isolation, King was charged with the murder of a fellow inmate. His co-defendant was a man named Grady Brewer, whom a guard had reportedly seen near the scene covered in blood. At trial, King was bound and gagged in the courtroom, and he was convicted anyway. A defendant physically restrained and silenced in front of the very jury meant to weigh his fate, in an American courtroom, is the kind of image that belongs to a much older and darker era of justice. And yet it happened in 1973, and the conviction it produced would stand for nearly 30 years. As with the Miller case, there was no physical evidence tying King to the killing. The witnesses who testified against him would later take it all back, saying their testimony had been coerced by prison officials, and another inmate eventually confessed to the stabbing outright. You would think that somewhere in all of that, someone in a position of authority would have spoken up and put a stop to it. No one did. King's conviction was finally overturned on appeal in 2001. Rather than risk facing another trial, he agreed to plead to a lesser charge of conspiracy in exchange for the time he had already served, and on February 8, 2001, he walked out of Angola a free man. He had spent 29 years in solitary confinement and 31 years at the prison in total, and he became the first of the Angola 3 to taste freedom. He has never once stopped insisting that he was innocent of the crime that kept him in that cell. What King did with his freedom became its own kind of answer to the men who had caged him. He wrote an autobiography about his decades at the bottom of the system. He received an honorary doctorate of laws from a university in England, gave a TEDx talk that he titled simply "Alone," and addressed the European Parliament on the subject of solitary confinement. He became known, of all things, for the pray lines he had taught himself to make inside his cell, a recipe he called free lines and sold to keep the cause funded. After Hurricane Katrina tore through New Orleans, he helped found a community relief collective there. And through all of it, he never stopped campaigning for the two men still locked inside, Woodfox and Wallace. By the time King walked free, the case of the Angola 3 had become an international cause. Documentary films were made about them, including one narrated by the actor Samuel L. Jackson, and a separate film built entirely around Herman Wallace and his imagined dream house. Between the three of them, the men had spent well over 100 years in solitary confinement, a figure that is genuinely difficult to even process. Their lawsuit against the state of Louisiana argued that holding human beings in isolation for decades on end amounted to cruel and unusual punishment, and it helped push that question into courtrooms far beyond the Louisiana state line. As for who actually killed Brent Miller back in 1972, the honest answer is that no one can say for certain. A former Angola inmate who later became a journalist wrote that another prisoner had confessed to him, back in 1973, that he was the one who had killed the guard. That claim was never corroborated, and the man who supposedly made it is long dead. The most truthful thing anyone has managed to say about it is that we will probably never really know. Today, Robert King is alive and free. With Albert Woodfox's death in 2022, he is the last living member of the Angola 3. He has said that no person can spend that long caged and come out the other side unscathed, and he has never pretended that he somehow did. The Angola 3 left prison without the state ever truly proving its case against them. The final man on this list is the exact opposite story. With him, there was never any serious doubt about what he had done. The only thing left to decide was whether it would cost him his life. Barry Edge. When the 6 men made their move inside the education building at Angola on that December night in 1999, somebody had to be first. According to the state, the man who brought a hammer down on Captain David Knaps's head, before the others closed in to stab and beat him, was Barry Edge. By that night, Edge was already serving a life sentence for killing one man. The only question his trial would settle was whether a jury would now send him to his death for killing a second. Edge had come to Angola out of Violet, Louisiana, in St. Bernard Parish. On May 5, 1985, he shot and killed a man named Clifford Stover, Jr., firing twice in the parking lot of Stover's apartment in Gretna. He was convicted of second-degree murder. His appeal was rejected in 1987, and he was sent away for life. By the night of the escape attempt, he had served 14 years of that sentence. Inside the escape itself, Edge was no peripheral figure. The state placed him at the very front of the violence, the man whose blow opened the assault on Captain Knaps inside that building before the rest of the group closed in around the captain. It was a role that would shape how prosecutors spoke about him for the next decade, and it was the reason they came after him seeking the death penalty. Of the 5 men who survived the escape, Edge was the last to face a jury. In October of 2013, a panel of 8 women and 4 men convicted him of first-degree murder for his part in the captain's death. The penalty phase is where his case turned. The jury deliberated for nearly 4 hours over whether to send Edge to death row, and in the end, they simply could not agree. Their vote came down 9-3 in favor of death, short of the unanimity that Louisiana required, and Judge Jerome Winsberg declared a mistrial on the sentence. That deadlock left Edge with a second life sentence rather than an execution date. The portrait the state painted of Edge during the trial was a chilling one. A forensic psychiatrist named Michael Wellner testified that Edge displayed antisocial personality traits and showed no remorse, and he described a pattern running through Edge's history of brutality aimed squarely at people who were outnumbered and vulnerable. The defense pushed back, arguing that Edge suffered from bipolar disorder and had never intended for anyone to die. The prosecutor put it far more plainly. He reminded the jurors that Edge's first life sentence had not worked, that they were now sitting in judgment on his second, and that all it takes for evil to prevail is for good men and women to stand by and do nothing. There is a grim irony buried in how these cases came out. Edge, the man the state identified as the one who struck the very first blow, the man a psychiatrist had described as remorseless, walked away from his trial with his life. 2 of the men who came after him through the courts, Jeffrey Clark and David Brown, were sentenced to die. The difference did not come down to a careful measure of who was most responsible. It came down to 12 jurors in a single room, and on the day Edge's jury sat down to decide, 3 of them would not vote for death. There is one more thread to Edge's story, and it reaches directly back into another man's case. Before Edge ever stood trial, prosecutors disclosed a statement from an inmate named Richard Domingue. According to Domingue, Edge had confessed that it was only he and Jeffrey Clark who had decided to kill Knaps, and no one else. That single statement did not save Edge himself, but years later it would become the centerpiece of David Brown's long fight to overturn his own death sentence. The argument being that the men truly responsible had already named themselves. The same words that surfaced quietly before one trial would echo loudly through another. By the time Edge's case finally reached a jury, the prosecutions of the men involved in the 1999 escape had been grinding through Louisiana's courts for the better part of a decade and had already cost the state millions of dollars. Edge was the last piece of that long, expensive effort to fall into place. He is alive today, serving life without the possibility of parole at Angola, the man the state says struck first on the night a captain died. All of these cases run through the same prison walls, and most of these men are still behind them today. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.